My name is Stan Rosen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Southern California. Welcome to the Living History program of the USC Emeritus Center. Today I will be interviewing Otto Schnepp, Professor Emeritus of Chemistry and currently Director of the East Asian Studies Center. What I'd like to do at the beginning, before asking questions, is to give you some background on Professor Schnepp in terms of where he's lived, where he studied, where he's taught, his administrative positions, the research he's done, and the honors that he's been awarded. Otto was born in Vienna, Austria in 1925. He lived in Shanghai in China from 1939 to 1948. While there, he received a bachelor's degree, a BS in chemistry at St. John's University in 1947. Following that, he lived in Berkeley, California for about 4.5 years from 1948 to 1952 and received a Ph.D. in chemistry from University of California, Berkeley in 1951. He then took a job in Israel, living in Haifa for the next 13 years from 1952 to 1965. While there, he taught at the Israel Institute of Technology. Since 1965, he's been a resident of Los Angeles, California, teaching in the chemistry department at USC from 1965 to 1992. Since 1992, he's been a professor emeritus of chemistry at USC. In terms of his administrative positions, we can start with his position as the first counselor for science and technology at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, in China. In fact, Otto established that section in the U.S. Embassy, and it continues on today. At the time, he was on leave from USC. From 1989 to 1992, he was chair of the Department of Chemistry at USC. From 1994 until the present, he has been director of the East Asian Studies Center at USC. That position will continue until December 31st this year. In terms of the many areas of research he's engaged in, I'll mention only a few. His major field has been physical chemistry, in particular optical molecular spectroscopy. But he's also done a lot of work on China in terms of his own research, particularly in science and technology, also in China's Visiting Scholar Program to the United States, starting in the late 70s to the mid-80s. He worked in that area, and has done some important work on U.S.-China technology transfer, including being the major author of an important book on the subject. All this stemmed as a result of his position in Beijing in the embassy from 1980 to 1982. Finally, in terms of awards, let me start with the earliest, and again, I'm skipping several awards, of course, for reasons of time. But in 1978, Otto was awarded the Associate's Award for Creative Scholarship and Research at USC. In 1992, he received the Albert S. Robbenheimer Distinguished Faculty Award from the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. In 1998, he received the Distinguished Professor Emeritus Award. And let me just list one award outside USC, although there are others as well. In 1982, the U.S. Department of State awarded him a Superior Honor Award for his work at the embassy in Beijing. Now, to begin the questions. Otto, you've lived and worked in so many diverse environments over the years. How would you compare the academic cultures in the United States, in Israel, and in China, and how have they changed?
Well, I think that, of course, my experience in the academic culture, should we say, of China, my personal experience as a student, was a long time ago. So that it has certainly changed since then. But at the time, I found, I think it's interesting, I can compare the experience as a student, first of all, in Shanghai at St. John's University, to my experience when I came to UC Berkeley. I found that in China, there were, at that particular university at least, I had to rely a great deal on memorizing and repeating information, although, of course, in the field of chemistry, there's also a lot of problem solving that is involved, but there also was a great deal of memorizing to be done. When I came to Berkeley, I found that the questions asked on midterms examinations were of such a nature that they relied a great deal more on reasoning and relying on information in a sense, but more deductive answers. So I found, to my personal liking, I found the experience in Berkeley very satisfying, because obviously I came from somewhere quite different. I did not know what to expect. I did not know how I would perform in that new environment, and I was very glad to see that it suited me well. Now, when it comes to comparing teaching, I can speak to this in Israel at the Israel Institute of Technology, and here, both of which I did for many years. There was quite a difference because in Israel, at the Israel Institute of Technology, I taught classes for engineers and classes for science majors. And there was a major difference right there. For one thing, the youngsters, the students who attend university are more mature because they have gone typically through 3 years of army service, of compulsory army service, and which I believe is a process of maturation, particularly under the circumstances they live in. And so on one hand, more mature, very goal-oriented, very motivated. On the other hand, they are less willing to accept authority and also accept discipline, particularly the engineering students, which were large classes meaning 30, 40, 50 students. And I had to learn a hard lesson to just wait them out and to accept them as they are. I first had some reactions to that. I wanted to impose more discipline, which was useless. It just backfired and didn't work. On the other hand, when here in the United States, I found that the discipline never was a problem, except teaching a large freshman class when students, there again, I had to accept that students will talk in the back, they will walk out in the middle, and all that I feel in the course of the years I had to mature to and to know how to live with and tolerate. That is one area. Now, when it comes to research conditions, there were very great difficulties, very great differences and difficulties in Israel. When I began there, that was when I arrived in 1952, quite a long time ago. The conditions were such that equipment all came from abroad. Many spare parts and accessories also were not available locally, so that we had to do long-term planning. We had to have parts in reserve, and we worked therefore quite differently and quite with difficulties continually. If we slipped up and and something was missing and we didn't have a spare or something broke down, then often it delayed us for months. Here, of course, on the other hand, are available. Most suppliers are within phone reach. Were at the time when I worked, at least, with phone reach. Now it's, of course, even better, email and so on, and fax. But at the time when I was active, that was the major way of communicating, telephone, and that was wonderful. The telephones worked. When I would add, when I lived in Israel and worked there, telephones were also in rather poor condition. Now it is very much improved and quite good. At the time, we had problems getting somewhere, making contact. When you managed to get the number, then it was busy, and so there was a great deal of frustration in that area. So in all those areas, there were a lot of different problems. On the other hand, I found that students, graduate students, at the Israel Institute of Technology, Technion is another term. There was an original name for that institution. The graduate students were highly motivated, very dedicated, and very supportive and loyal in promoting and pushing our projects. There's also quite some difference in the financing. Finances mostly came from the institution, so that it depended on allocations from a bureaucracy. Whereas here in the United States, in the sciences, every faculty member is kind of in business for himself or herself, to get outside grants outside the university in order to finance the research after an initial setup arrangement. It is true that in Israel also, towards the end, my later years there was support that I obtained from the, the Air Force. The Air Force Research Office had an office in Belgium, and they supported actually research. I had research grants from them. That was a great help. In particular, one other very important point is the distances to meetings and how to meet colleagues from other countries. Here in the United States, there are lots of meetings and conferences, which are very beneficial, of course, for exchange and just information-wise. Israel, of course, is further away, and every time it was an overseas or at least to Europe, one had to go to Europe. Again, with the Air Force research support came subsidized or free trips to the United States from certain centers in Europe. For example, from Paris, there's a base, and from Paris I could fly to the United States supported by these grants. So in these many ways there are differences. Now, what the situation is in China and how it has evolved since then, I can speak to that just a little bit because I've been interested to follow science and technology in China and what happens in laboratories and so forth. There, the great differences are that support for research now is obtained also from an agency which is parallel to our National Science Foundation. It's called the National Natural Science Foundation of China. But in this case, they do not need to get support for salaries. Here, on the other hand, it's always important to obtain support for postdoctoral fellows as well as pre-doctoral students to get research assistantships, and that way you get work done. So it is, you need more money here to do it. There are more ways of getting it. On the other hand, in China, it's quite a struggle, particularly because a lot of materials that are very common, in common use, and one thing I have in mind is liquid nitrogen, is quite inexpensive in the United States, quite inexpensive, where it is still considerably expensive in China. And particularly liquid helium is also necessary for some of the research areas and is very difficult to obtain in China. And I do know that people there often do research, preparatory research in their laboratories, and then find a way of coming to the United States to a laboratory where there is liquid helium, where they can finalize their work.
I have a second question, Otto, and this is similar to the first one, but confined more to USC itself. How would you compare and contrast the skills needed to chair a department here at USC versus the skills needed to direct a center, which tends to be much more interdisciplinary?
Well, actually, I have some experience also that you haven't listed. And that is, I was really department head, it was called, in Israel.
I didn't know that.
For a period of 2 years. I must say it was at an early age, relatively speaking, for myself, and I was asked to take care of a situation which was a little difficult. And there, again, here, in a department, certainly in my experience in the chemistry department, there are institutionalized proceedings and institutionalized, shall we say, power structure or authority structure, really. It's better to say than power. And that is, the department meeting has has an important place. And it is really the authority that a chairman can go to, or any faculty member can in fact appeal to. Now that is not so institutionalized, and was not, at least when I was there in Israel. But that is not really a concern. So there was more authority, but then that meant at the same time that there was more unknown or less known, there were less known undercurrents that were not always easy to deal with. Now, here, if comparing being department chair to being director of East Asian Studies, there are very important differences that make it a great deal easier to be director of the East Asian Studies Center than to be department chair. And that comes from the fact that the East Asian Studies Center does not have faculty to deal with. So I initially thought there was no recruiting to be done, nor promotions to be dealt with, and appointments, promotions, all this is political and is sometimes fraught with complications. Now, as a department chair, there are all these things to be dealt with in addition to the administrative work of assigning teaching, as well as taking care of budget. Now, first I thought that would make an important difference, and it did, except for the fact that I found out that I obtained money from the Korea Foundation for an appointment, seed money for a new appointment, and then the dean said, well, now it's up to you to chair the committee to do that, to recruit for that position. So I found myself, again, I thought, in this position that I had to deal with recruitment. And in fact, it was complex because it was an interdisciplinary committee, simply because it was not determined in advance which department the appointment would be in. And I would like to say that there are some people who were really very helpful during that process. For example, Gordon Berger was a member of that committee, and he was very helpful in stabilizing the conditions. Now, you were a member of that committee, and that was also very supportive. However, there were forces there that were surging back and forth that were quite complex. So, but in general, it is true that these conditions are quite different. And now, budget-wise, I find also there are differences. We have, at the East Asian Studies Center, we have the support of the Department of Education, which is a kind of a backdrop, at least as long as we get them renewed, which I have been successful in doing, fortunately. And so that has given us a certain backdrop to finance activities. And I think the most important function, I thought, as East Asian Studies Center director, was to try to further and to encourage and to support any academic activities that there was opportunity for.
What have been the achievements that you're most proud of as chair of the Department of Chemistry and as director of the East Asian Studies Center?
Well, yes. Now, to start with, when I was chair of the chemistry department, it is hard to say that I was really proud of things the way they happened at the time, because I did not really have an opportunity on that occasion. The time when I was chair of the department was 1989 to 92. That was a period at USC when the number of students decreased. The number of students at USC, that was the time, if you remember, that the private universities all over the United States had great difficulties recruiting students because of the cost of private universities, accompanied by a recession in the economy. So therefore, I really faced a situation where I did not have the opportunity to expand the department, to go out and improve the department, but on the contrary, I was asked to contract and to decrease budgets and to, in fact, decrease staff, as well as refrain from appointing faculty to replace attrition. So it was not a time of really having an opportunity to do the positive things, and I don't consider that period as one of achievement, except that I can say I managed the difficult circumstances, and as you can well imagine, that also reflected on the faculty, the morale of the faculty, and so it was the job, I felt, of the department chair to shield the department and faculty as much as possible from the trends which were rather negative at that time. Fortunately, we know that USC has recovered from that period and recovered very well, and so far in the past since that happened.
Let's move to the work you've done regarding China, particularly with the work you've done on Chinese science and technology transfer issues, the initial visiting scholar program. Can you describe some of the achievements in those areas for us?
Right, gladly. Well, let's see. First of all, my experience, as you point out, as the science advisor, science counselor at the embassy in Beijing, formed the background to that, brought me back to Asia and to China specifically. And that was an important event in my life that I came back to close contact with that. And then after I came back then, I thought the most interesting thing at the time in science and technology was, in fact, this program of, the initial program of visiting scholars. And in the United States, there were quite a number of those, and I surveyed some of those, as well as surveying the returned scholars, and surveying their superiors in China. I found that in the United States, those that were in the United States, in my sample of roughly 130 such scholars, there was a division of about 70%, I found, that were successful in the sense that they made concrete contributions to their research projects here. That is according to the testimony of the professors who supervised them. Now, this is sort of interesting, the 70%, because there's an old story of Mao Zedong, who said the San Qi Kai, which means there's always a division, 70%, 30%, 70% positive, 30% negative. So when I first found that and told people about that finding, they laughed at me and said that, well, that'll go over big in China. People will say that you just follow the party line. Nevertheless, it was an actual finding. Now, when I reviewed what these people then contributed when they returned to China, and perhaps I should say these were all people who did not have higher degrees, formal higher degrees. They also did not seek higher degrees while in the United States. They were typically here for somewhere between 1 and 2 years, many for 2 years, and had their families in China and returned after that to their families and their positions there. And I found that these people really made a very significant contribution to science and engineering in China in a variety of ways. For one, they introduced the concept of communication between groups, between institutions. In China, there was before then the custom that every research group kept pretty well to themselves and were not really willing to tell others what they were doing. They worked in this kind of isolation, and they brought back, these returning visiting scholars brought back with them from the US this concept of seminars, exchanges, interactions, and that broke through those walls that existed. And I think that made a very important contribution. Then the major contribution was that they came back with knowledge about the frontiers of science. They brought back where those frontiers were. And at the time, that was not easy to get to in China. They hadn't read journals for years, and although they started getting journals, it's not so easy to get that information by reading. This way, they had immersion in atmospheres where this information was common knowledge. So they brought that, and I think that was the major contribution they made. They brought China up to date. At that time also, the World Bank began to give the first loan to China, and that went to institutions of higher learning for equipment. And so that was introduced, and that was an important aspect of it. I think, unfortunately, still today in China, there are difficulties in keeping equipment up to date. There's still the concept, you acquire equipment, and then it's there. Yeah. But the trouble is that it changes from year to year. And that is still something that is a little weak, partly because of limits on financial resources. So that, I think, was the major finding there. Right. Now, when it comes, if we go on to technology transfer, our findings are China, the Chinese are very difficult bargainers, and they are very intent on getting the advantage and not giving away advantage. And that has somewhat lessened with the years, but it started certainly in the 80s to be almost ideological, that they must protect themselves from foreign exploitation. And that is certainly justified in view of their history. That was one aspect. The other important aspect was caused by their experience with Russia. They had had a great deal of interaction with Russia, and then one day, out of the blue, the Russians decided to quit, and they packed up and took away with them all the plans and all the blueprints and left. And many projects were in the middle of implementation. And so they learned from that, and the result was that they overreacted and wanted all the information at once in any of these technology transfer projects. And it was difficult to satisfy their hunger for that, for information. And it is a common experience that also visitors here, students, Chinese students here, and visitors in training for an enterprise for technology transfer have the tendency to want to Xerox everything they can get a hold of and ship it home. And so they find that this happens at night, at all hours, and in fact, many of the American companies whom I surveyed expressed some amusement over this intensity to get hold of whatever they can. Of course, the American companies also have their area of discretion and secrecy, if you like, but which they protect. However, that is an interesting aspect of that. So these were some of the findings, and particularly how negotiations were done, and how the Americans often thought that something had been agreed to, and that was finished, and they were not expecting to discuss it again. However, in the eyes of the Chinese side, that is never so. They always feel that it's always open to renegotiation. Everything is continually open to renegotiation. And that was a major psychological difficulty, in fact, that many American executives had, because they were outraged by that approach. And they had to calm down and get used to this and learn how to deal with it. There was another aspect of it. So these were some of the aspects. But many of the many of these technology transfer programs, transactions, were successful. Not many made money. That is still, the jury is still out on that. Where's the profit? And the Chinese say, well, you have to take the long-term view. And How long, we don't say. So these are some of the aspects of that, great difficulties. And also, of course, difficulties in training people, which is where technology transfer really occurs on the person-to-person level, because of cultural differences, language barriers, and so forth that were had to overcome in all these cases.
What have been your greatest achievements in research in the field of chemistry, since I know you've won the award, the Associate's Award for Creative Scholarship and Research back in 1978?
Oh yes, well, I'll make that part a little short, so not to become too technical. But basically, my contributions were in the field of molecular solids, actually, and their structure and excited states. In other words, spectra. Interaction with light is what spectroscopy is, and the investigation of structure of matter by means of the interaction with light. So there, in that area of molecular solids, which are loosely bound solids, I made a number of important contributions that were widely cited, and exciton structure of benzene was one example, and of many other organic molecular solids, as well as my pioneering, I would say, immodestly, investigations of rare gas solids, which are kind of a prototype of molecular solids, that is, solids in which the units are well defined and the interaction between them is relatively weak. That is one aspect. I then also made some quite original contributions in so-called circular dichroism measurements. Circular dichroism measurements is another way of measuring a spectrum that has different aspects to it. It has to do with the rotation of the plane of polarization of light. So it's investigated with polarized light and to what degree the polarization changes as we move through the wavelength spectrum. We here at USC made an original instrument, constructed an original instrument that was capable of making measurements in a region which had not been measured before, so-called vacuum ultraviolet. So we broke through some barriers there, and as a result of that, we're able to investigate systems that were not approachable before. For example, I've mentioned the rare gas solids that is at rather short wavelengths in so-called vacuum ultraviolet. The reason it's called the vacuum ultraviolet is because it has to be investigated in vacuum because oxygen absorbs light in that region, so you can't have any air in between. So these are two areas. A third area to which I made contributions is the vibrational spectrum of high temperature molecules. High temperature molecules meaning molecules that only exist at high temperatures, from, for example, sodium chloride, if you like, common salt at high temperature will have vaporization and solid and gas, and molecules in the gas phase that have certain special properties. So these are some of the areas that I have contributed to, and evidently the judges or the people, the referees, were kind enough to think that these contributions were of importance to science and to the field.
Otto, what brought you to USC after 13 years in Israel?
Yes, I originally went to Israel because of a great conviction on my part that that was a worthwhile enterprise after my personal experiences and the way I, of course, survived by some coincidences, but I was very greatly influenced by the Holocaust and what it almost did to me as well, and family, and many people I knew. So I went there with a great conviction, and I felt I had wanted to do my best to contribute to that enterprise. Now, after some years being there, I experienced that life was life, and it didn't hold that compulsion anymore, that compelling drive, so that I felt after some years free to make my choices. Also, it happened that I was called upon to be the head of the department at a young age, and subsequent to that, I experienced some discomfort there because there was a dominant figure there who wanted to take over and felt he had to move me out of the way from any place of influence, perhaps, that he thought. And so I felt under some pressure and restrictions, and finally I was offered a position here. David Dowes, who is in the Department of Chemistry, and who later I will mention as chair of the department, actually, he asked me if I would be interested, and I said I really wasn't that interested, but nevertheless came for a visit. And then some months after that visit, things got to be unpleasant for me, and I decided to just put down my foot and say that my basic needs are such and such, and then when these were not met, I said, well, I have an offer, and I left. And so I did go and come here to the United States, which was a good move in some ways. Of course, I regret the loss of being there, and a different quality of life, a different style of life, but at the same time, here the life offered me different things. Of course, I had been in the United States, I'd been at Berkeley, and so I knew California, and I was looking forward to a different experience, a different adventure, if you like. Life is, in my view, a series of adventures. So I did that, and I have not regretted it, partly because it's not my nature to regret, but also because there were lots of opportunities that I found here that I could do things here that I could not do in Israel in terms of support for my work.
Otto, we've talked about your achievements in various areas. I'd like you to say something about the difficulties you faced, and perhaps some disappointments, if there are any, in your own research agenda, as well as chair of chemistry and director of the East Asian Studies Center.
As far as academic work and research goes, of course, in science, there are always disappointments to be dealt with. Because you see, somehow in the social sciences, you can have a project, and whatever you find out is newsworthy and publishable. But in science, it's not that way. I've planned experiments and never got any results. And you cannot publish not having results or what not to do. Nobody really wants that. So it's a little different because of that. And so inevitably there are failures. Now, I did some things actually already during my thesis period, where I engaged in a project and didn't get anywhere, and then changed and found other approaches that did give results. So that is innate, and I learned that this is part of doing science, in fact. Of course, also as faculty, we work through students. Their students engage in postdoctorals and so forth. And again, not always these things were successful. Some postdoctorals got nothing done, got no result whatsoever. And then things changed. Also, let me point out that in my work on circular dichroism, as I mentioned, I pioneered there certain instrumentation and area and results. And there, that was quite a long struggle, and we struggled with lack of success. There were things we planned and we couldn't make it work. And then we found another technology that we put in, and it did eventually work. But there were times of disappointment. In fact, research is, in the natural sciences, certainly, it is often said that it is a series of ups and downs, manic times and depressive times. And it is nice to be in an academic institution because the lows, the disappointments, when they come, there is always something solid in the background, and I found that very true, and that is the teaching. The teaching is a kind of a solid background of activity that I always felt was worthwhile and satisfying, whereas I would imagine if I were in just a research institution, that would be much harder because there isn't such a steady backdrop. So that's as far as science goes. As far as difficulties in administrative work, I learned very early that, because of my early experience in Israel, that is really something that I had to adjust to and learn to absorb the downs of that, particularly the dealing with people. And everybody in an academic department is sort of a prima donna, and it is the chair's task to deal with that on one hand, and on the other hand, there is the dean on top who dishes out a lot of frustration in terms of course, his limitations of what he can provide. And it is commonly said that the department chair is probably the most difficult position in an academic institution because he gets squeezed in between, somehow between those, the department, the faculty and their interests, and the administration above. I have found that when I was department chair here, I also experienced a great deal of tension with many of the faculty at one time or another. People really don't like to be told no, no matter in what diplomatic terms they are, and they will push and press. And as a result, it was hard for me to adjust to the fact that not everybody loves me all the time. And I had to get over that. In addition to that, we had in the chemistry department, and still they are there, forceful personalities, shall we say, some of high stature, of great stature, which makes it, of course, harder. They have more clout, and in fact, the administration, would like the chairman to make everything right. The deans the first thing they do is they blame the chair, because if they don't know how to handle a problem, it must be the chair's fault. So that causes all this problems. And I've had some difficult times, and I've times where I've had to, I'll characterize it this way, where I felt I had to be tough and keep my position and under great pressures, and then I'd go home and kind of release the tension and tremble because of a great build-up tensions from that. So it is, as you say, it is not easy. And I think the secret of being a good leader, an administrator, really a successful leader, is really to be able to absorb tensions and the difficulties caused also by people not doing what is expected, or what I expected of them. And that is a great secret, because if I expect something and don't get it, and then go and get after that person and accuse the person of that, then of course that caused more friction rather than making it better. It's always attractive to think of this very powerful, very tough guy who can dominate and deal with that. Well, I never was that powerful a figure in terms of my stature that I could do that. Like they say, Linus Pauling was chairman of the chemistry department at Caltech, and he probably didn't have the difficulties I had, although I'm not sure, because he had correspondingly also powerful people to deal with. I think it's a universal situation. So that is certainly true. Now, it's also true in the East Asian Studies Center, as director of that, I think that was not so, the tensions were never so high. There were some things that happened, and as you know, I have had occasion to talk to you about it because you were a friend and were willing to listen. But I don't think, in retrospect, and that it was really so difficult to do that.
Otto, you were at Berkeley during a difficult political period from 1948 to 1952, the height of McCarthyism in the United States. Did this affect your work in any way? And did you anticipate before you came here from abroad that the United States had such a political atmosphere after the Second World War?
Well, anticipate, certainly not. I had no idea really what things were like. When I came in 1948, I didn't know anything about it. I did participate, or I was present, certainly. I think 1949 was the highest involvement of mine. I had become a teaching assistant. I'd got into graduate school and obtained an assistant and a teaching assistantship. And at that time, there was the loyalty oath that was required by the regents of the University of California, if you remember, and there was resistance to that in the academic community, although the academic community, really, the faculty kind of folded, except for 13 professors who resigned, not resigned, but they left. They were actually dismissed. They didn't resign. They were dismissed because they refused to sign the loyalty oath. And the teaching assistants also had a movement in this direction. And I participated in that, thinking that that was an important thing to do, until I realized one day that really I was not only vulnerable, but also out of place there. I was not a resident at the time in the United States. I was there on a student visa. And so I realized at one point that that was really inappropriate, really, for me to participate in any kind of struggle of the kind. And so I withdrew from that, and however, the tensions were there all around me, as you say. I will also say that the science departments probably were less intensely involved, and the graduate students, certainly of whom I was a legitimate part, did not, I don't remember there being a lot of tension. There was some criticism, I remember, of Kenneth Pitzer. Kenneth Pitzer was an important leader in the chemistry department there, and he also was appointed in my time. Actually, he was away some of the time I was there as director of the Nuclear Energy Commission. And then he came back and also came by and told about his work and was much criticized by faculty members and students concerning his attitude that this was for him a job to be done rather than something where he would have had to exercise moral judgments of what is good and what is not good. So there were those criticisms, and as you know, Pitzer went on and actually was called too liberal by the Stanford trustees at one point. So he had various experiences. But anyway, to come back to my experience, I think that was basically the extent of my involvement experience. I will say one more thing, and that is concerning those 13 professors, I think it was 13, who resigned, and they were mostly, by the way, theoretical scientists who did not have laboratories and were easily movable. In those days, there weren't even computers, so that they were easily movable. And they resigned and then sued the trustees. And one of my great moments here was when I read the judgment of the Supreme Court of the state of California that decided in their favor and against the trustees, in the middle of the big hubbub of McCarthyism, which was a very enlightening experience for me, which I often remind Americans of the strength of the system and the independence of the courts that made so much difference, and eventually, of course, led also to the termination of this, of this phenomenon we call McCarthyism. So that may have had a great influence on me.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us how USC has changed over the last 35 years?
Well, let's see. I came here during the time of Topping, President Topping. And President Topping, I would say, he had a very important lieutenant, and that was Zorab Kaprilyan. As you know, this building is named after him, and he's a legend on campus, although he's not, again, university loved by everybody, even in retrospect. But he, I think, was a very important power, and he worked very well under President Topping. Topping was a strong president, a strong force, and he was known, he mingled, he was approachable, and at the same time very much respected, and did a great deal to change the course of the university by reorganizing I understand, the trustees, the board of trustees, and raising money for important projects. He, with Kaprilyan, was very supportive of the development of science and engineering on campus when I arrived. And that period went on through, say, something like 70, into the 70s. In 1970, actually, I moved into the Seaver Science Center, which was a very unique, and is a very unique building, because it has different disciplines in it. The 6th and 7th floor is chemistry, was since 1970 and still is. Actually, there's more chemistry now because Kurt Wittig is on the 4th floor as well. Then there are engineering and material science that is on different floors. And that building was built with the help of a grant. I think it was called the National Science Foundation Centers of Excellence grant that was applied for, and Caprillion was in charge of that, and David Dowse from chemistry represented the department there. And with that concept and that project, it typified the atmosphere here to go forward. And so I came here under a rather positive atmosphere. Then there was, I think after Topping, there was a period of lesser, shall we say, progress, change, achievement, although the faculty progressively improved and got higher academic standards, achieved higher academic standards progressively. And that is when Hubbard was president, and then afterwards Zumberg. Now, Caprillion